There are now more than 80,000 cases worldwide.
Characters in the world's most popular online game are being wiped out by a plague.
Health officials say it could turn into a global pandemic. The CDC issuing its highest travel warning, telling Americans to avoid all non-essential travel.
We've got a snapshot of what potentially could happen with humanity.
It's time to do everything you will do to prepare.
In late 2004, World of Warcraft was officially released, and it instantly took the world by storm.
Oh, it's a lot better than we usually do.
Alright, thumbs up.
Ready, guys?
Let's do this. Leroy Jenkins!
Oh my god, he just ran in.
MMORPGs weren't exactly a new concept, but they'd never quite managed to pick up as much traction and impact a mainstream gaming audience like this before. The internet was still a relatively new concept, and users had never before been able to interact person to person on such a large scale. However, only a year after its release, an in-game disaster would take place of such magnitude that 15 years later, it had become the basis for a real-life scientific study, born out of desperation during one of the biggest medical anomalies of the 21st century. What you're seeing is one of the few remaining videos that still exist of what happened almost 20 years ago. Everything that happened here predates YouTube itself. That, combined with the fact that screen recording wasn't accessible back in the early 2000s, unfortunately means that most of the actual evidence for this has been lost to time. If you haven't played World of Warcraft before, it could be hard to grasp what's truly happening here, beyond the piles of skeletons lining the streets. So, to give you context on this and why it turned out to be such a scientific discovery, let's return to 2005.
Thousands of characters are being wiped out by a plague with some striking similarities with what could happen in the real world.
We got a snapshot of what potentially could happen with humanity.
World of Warcraft has the same premise as a typical RPG. You're given quests, and in return for completing these quests, you're also rewarded with gold, stronger items, and XP. However, alongside all of this, you're also sharing the world with other players who are logged in at the same time. All thanks to this brand new internet thingy, which for whatever reason makes this sound every time you turn it on and cuts out whenever your mum makes a phone call. While some players take the role-playing aspect a bit more seriously than others, for the most part the end goal is the same for everyone. Acquire enough gold, XP, and strong enough items so that you can defeat the final boss. In the case of World of Warcraft, the final boss comes in the form of raids, where you and 39 other people work together to take down a series of anything from fire elementals, dragons, female dragons, and in return you receive more gold and stronger items. As I'm explaining this, it doesn't quite sound so exciting, but it is fun, trust me. If you're thinking that finding 39 other people to do this with is kind of a lot, then you wouldn't be alone. In fact, Blizzard, the creators of WoW, also agreed, so they decided their next raid, Zul'Gurub, would only require 20 players. Although within only hours of this new raid going live, players started noticing that something just wasn't right.
So many people play the game worldwide that scientists say it's a model for what could happen if a real epidemic swept the globe.
In a typical raid environment, you're teleported into a separate instance so that players outside of your group can't walk in and interfere or be unintentionally affected by anything inside the raid. But despite this, only a few hours after the release of Zul'Gurub, reports slowly started coming in that players were dying to the final boss despite never entering the raid. So the question arose, how could this be happening? This is because the final boss in Zul'Gurub, named Hakkar. During the fight with Hakkar, he would occasionally infect a player with a disease called corrupted blood. This effect would deal damage over time to whoever was afflicted by it, and what's more, it could also be passed from character to character within the raid. At the time and inside the localized raid instance, this really was nothing more than a hindrance, intended to increase the difficulty of the fight, but as players would soon find out, this disease would have the ability to spread outside of the raid, which shouldn't have been possible. The first instance of corrupted blood had just made its way out of Zul'Gurub and into the rest of the world. Pandemonium quickly spread, as the pandemic didn't discriminate. Players tried their best to determine a cause for what was happening, and Blizzard themselves had to step in at one point. They didn't know how to fix it yet, but at the very least, they could impose a quarantine to stop it from spreading any further. However, all efforts came up short. No one could figure out how this happened or how to slow down what seemed like the inevitable destruction of the online community. But we know now. It all started with a hunter.
Peter Harvey says characters in the world's most popular online game are being wiped out by a plague that's so far proving unstoppable.
In order to understand how this happened, I need to give a quick overview of a class inside of WoW called Hunters. Hunters are largely based around their ability to do range damage. Rather than using a sword, staff, or some other type of melee weapon, they specialize in ranged alternatives such as bows and guns. Alongside this, to help supplement their playstyle, Hunters can also take pets to help them in combat and during questing. Having this pet out at all times can be pretty inconvenient due to the fact that they can pull enemies by walking too close to them. Due to this, there's an option to dismiss your pet, which will basically send them off to limbo indefinitely until you decide to summon them back to you. But this is where the trouble started. In the final fight of Zul'Gurub, it wasn't just players who could be affected with the corrupted blood debuff, it was also the pets. As soon as players made their way back to the main cities and resummoned their pets would subsequently spread the disease to other players. Although, given the debuff's short duration, after a couple of deaths this would be the end of it, right? Unfortunately, this wasn't really the case. Alongside players and pets being able to carry the corrupted blood debuff, it was also able to be spread to non-playable characters, or more commonly known as NPCs. NPCs are scattered all throughout the world, but most importantly, they're stationed in main cities so that players can head over to them to buy items, repair gear, and also pick up quests. However, NPCs are coded a little bit differently to the characters that people play. While they do have health bars, they're not actually able to take damage. After all, you need these NPCs alive so that people can actually play the game and for it to function as intended. But despite their inability to take damage, it was quickly discovered that they were still able to carry the disease. Any infected player or pet who walked past an NPC would then transfer corrupted blood over to them, except the NPC would just stand there holding it, not being able to take damage. This accelerated the small bug into a server-wide pandemic that was now unstoppable. Capital cities like Stormwind and Orgrimmar quickly became uninhabitable as dead bodies were strewn across the streets. As word began to spread, players quickly began searching for any clues as to what was going on. The world chat would explode anytime a city fell. We kept a close eye not only on our guild chat but on the world chat as well to see where not to go. We didn't want to catch it.
The game's characters are ignoring quarantine warnings, the virus is multiplying dramatically, and panic has set in.
An example of a big virus releasing in an environment, what happens to that virus once it's released?
There's a lot to be said about how much a World of Warcraft player might care about their character, and how much of a real life to virtual connection there could realistically be. After all, it's just pixels on a screen, right? However, as we'll get into a bit more later, this wasn't really the case. In fact, there was enough evidence and parallels to real life that this incident was later used as a basis for multiple scientific studies. World of Warcraft at the time had approximately 4 million players, all potentially investing hundreds of hours into their character. At the end of the day, it's still a game, but a game that for a lot of players is taken very seriously. A lot of guilds will run raiding schedules with set rotations of players so everyone can have a share of the high level loot. It's not uncommon that if you can't make a raid, you would put in for time off weeks in advance, much like an actual job.
What would you do if bird flu came and they said, oh, we'll all do what we say, we'll just do what the government tell us to do? Although they may say that, I think that's a highly unlikely situation in real life.
So what happened during the fallout? The hours, days, and weeks that were to come? The corrupted blood debuff itself dealt between 263 and 337 damage every 2 seconds while it was active. For a level 60 player, this really wasn't too big of a deal, and provided you were healthy, you'd be able to outlast it. But due to it making its way outside of the raid and into capital cities where players of all levels congregated, this quickly proved to be a problem. Any lower level players would die to this in a matter of seconds, and it's not like they could just level up to fix this, seeing as one of the main vectors for the transmission of the disease was the very NPCs they had to hand the quests into. Players were quick to respond to this though, seeing as major cities were now basically uninhabitable, people began spreading throughout some of the previously less populated areas of the map. In another fascinating parallel, certain groups of players would also try their best to act as healers, putting themselves at risk on the front line to help others. On the other side of this coin though, some higher level players who are less affected by the debuff would go out of their way to grief lower level players by intentionally infecting them, knowing that their smaller health pool wouldn't be enough to withstand the entirety of the damage and therefore killing them. I played during this time. People would hang around outside the cities and keep distance apart. There would be snake oil salesmen claiming they had amulets that protected against the new Blizzard server event. Top guilds were tracking safe pathing through capital cities that avoided infected NPCs, and you could pay them to take you inside to heal you through if you needed to visit your class trainer. It was a nightmare for low level players, but for high level players, it felt like an actual plague that you could win against with enough planning and coordination. There was also the group of people who weren't currently logged in but read about this in the forums or on the news and let curiosity get the better of them. When they went online to check, they suffered a similar fate, getting infected and thus spreading corrupted blood to even more players. One of the initial responses to this from Blizzard was to introduce quarantines, placing barriers around areas with a high density of infected players. However, this was short-lived as people quickly began finding ways to break out of containment. Eventually though, the pandemic was well and truly out of control. All previous attempts, whether driven by the community or Blizzard themselves, had come up short, and the developers had no choice left except to hard reset the servers, so on October 8th they reverted them to before the outbreak even happened, although now with a new patch that would stop this from being able to occur in the first place. A lot of people saw what had happened and thought it was just a stunt by Blizzard to get more attention and eyes onto World of Warcraft. Even if this wasn't the case, it definitely proved effective, with the case being covered by news outlets such as the Washington Post, and I mean, it happened almost 20 years ago and you're watching a YouTube video about it right now. So now we know what happened. How was this freak accident inside of a video game 20 years ago used for real life applications by scientists leading up to and during the 2020 pandemic? Modelling how humans will react to outbreaks of a disease or medical anomalies is almost impossible for doctors and scientists for a couple of reasons. One, you can't really intentionally give a group of people a deadly disease for pretty obvious reasons, and two, even if you could, humans react to these events in unpredictable ways. The math for these types of scenarios will only take you so far. Although multiple scientific papers were done on the corrupted blood incident, there was still a hesitance to use this as a model for how people would react in reality. After all, if there was a similar situation in real life where we had to get quarantined, no one would actually go out and intentionally make themselves sick, right?
Police in a college town in Ohio say house parties are booming, despite restrictions on gatherings to prevent the spread of the coronavirus.
The Center for Disease Control, aka the CDC, even reached out to the World of Warcraft game producer at the time, Shane DeBerry, quote, asking if they could study the simulation data in order to help them prepare for a real-world situation. However, Blizzard maintained the stance that it was in fact just a glitch, and also maintained the position that World of Warcraft is first and foremost a game and it was never designed to mirror reality or anything in the real world. In this 2007 paper written by Nina Pfefferman, she explores some of these topics, stating, "We believe that if the epidemic is designed and presented so as to seamlessly integrate with the rest of the persistent game world in such a way as to be a part of the user's expected experience in the game, we may be able to gain a deeper insight into the incredible complexity of infectious disease epidemiology in social groups."
There are games where you are encouraged to behave in a way that you would never behave offline. If you are in Call of Duty shooting people, this does not mean that you want to shoot people in real life.
When the 2020 pandemic rolled around, the only accessible type of study on how to combat global outbreaks like this was these papers written about a computer game from 15 years ago. The World Health Organization quickly started taking these a lot more seriously since it was, realistically, one of their only options. As time went on, and what previously seemed like a distant fantasy started to become a sobering reality, it quickly became their only option. In some way, shape or form, nearly every prediction and conclusion made from studying an in-game virtual pandemic came true. They warned that if people didn't think the situation was serious, they would flaunt rules and anyone less equipped to deal with the illness would suffer the consequences. And they did. Blizzard noticed the popularity that the plague brought them during its initial discovery, and decided to recreate it as a world event a few years later, leading up to the release of WoW's next expansion, Wrath of the Lich King. On October 2nd, 2008, several conspicuous crates, as they were called, began to appear throughout the world. Any player who inspected these would be given the debuff, "You're infected." You then had 10 minutes to either find someone to cast Cleanse on you, or you could try and find one of the multiple healer NPCs. As time went on, the severity of the event progressed. On day 2, there were plagued roaches who could also spread the disease. The 10 minutes given to find a cure was reduced to 5 minutes. On day 3, plagued residents were introduced. These NPCs could attack you and were also a vector for transmission. The timer given to find a cure was reduced again to only 2 minutes. While this was fun for a lot of players, others found it to be more of a hindrance than anything else. Much like the initial corrupted blood incident, NPCs were able to be infected, and back in the older iterations of WoW, you did have to rely a lot on NPCs for day-to-day activities. Thanks to the re-release of Classic WoW, there is actually some footage in higher quality than 360p. This is what it looked like when you got infected.
So we just can't use the auction house, is that it? Okay, great. The Flight Master's fucking dead. So now we've got to run over all there ourselves. Alright, what's this? Vier, come to me. I need you to dispel a disease. I need you to dispel disease quickly. I'm right here. Yeah, nice. Okay, alright, we're good. We're good.
Thank you, Asmongold, for the content. Some people have theorized that this was the planned follow-up to the corrupted blood incident, but this time with scientists involved, studying reactions to help map out some of the framework for diseases in real life. However, these are at best just theories. While there really isn't any way to properly predict human behaviour in disastrous situations, models like that made in 2005, combined with more recent knowledge, are all working together to hopefully provide a better future.